So my name is Rohit. I study the history of science and mathematics because I love to observe the evolution of ideas over extremely long time periods, like thousands of years. Let me give you an example. This is something you're all familiar with, but the context is interesting. This is in 1637, the French lawyer and amateur mathematician, Pierre de Fermat, is reading a book called Arithmetica written by Diophantus of Alexandria in 250 AD. And he's thinking about the Pythagorean theorem. And he thinks to himself, what if I restrict this equation to integer solutions, not to geometric solutions? And what if I replace 2, the power 2, with something else like 3, 4, 5, any number n? Would this equation still have solutions? And this is an interaction happening between a mathematician and a book written 1400 years before him by another mathematician. It's a direct conversation across time. And it leads to a result called Fermat's last theorem, which was not a theorem, because Fermat wrote that I have a marvelous proof of this proposition, but he wrote down this thing in the margin of this book, and he says this margin is too small for my proof. Funny thing is, it was not proven until 1995 by Andrew Wiles. And this wasn't like the odd occasion where Fermat was interacting with ancient texts. In fact, he spent a large amount of time reconstructing the lost books of a geometer called Apollonius of Perga, and specifically one book called The Plane Loci, which was written in 250 BC. And Fermat himself said that expressing these ancient geometric constructions in the language of algebra developed by François Viète and other contemporary mathematicians directly led to the creation of analytical geometry. So what I want to show by these two examples is that when a modern mathematician or scientist interact with a very, very ancient idea, he's not interacting with an inferior culture or a less sophisticated culture. It depends on your imagination to see where you can lead from that simplicity to sophistication. Another example of the same phenomena in history is, you've heard of Euclid's Elements. It contains the basic axioms from which geometry can be built up from scratch. One of these is the parallel postulate, which says that if these two angles sum up to 180 degrees, then these two lines will be parallel and they will never intersect. So it's important to respect ancient knowledge, but with a slightly suspicious eye. So that's exactly what subsequent people did. And they always thought that this is somewhat artificial, and this theorem should be, it's a theorem, it's not an axiom. You should be able to build it from smaller assumptions. So for a long time, they tried to disprove it using proof by contradiction. They failed. So finally they said, okay, we don't need this axiom anymore. Let's see if we can still have geometry without this. So suddenly, 3 new kinds of geometries were born from only one kind of geometry, which is called non-Euclidean. So if I draw a triangle on the surface of the Earth, then the sum of the angles inside that triangle will be greater than 180 degrees because it's a curved triangle. And I can have a triangle in hyperbolic space, which is where the sum is less than 180 degrees. And this is a series of etchings by the famous artist M.C. Escher, where he has tried to depict exactly that in hyperbolic space. So this is Euclid, which is extremely ancient Greek mathematics, but throughout the centuries, people have been referring to this book, questioning ideas within this book, and learning new things. So from Omar Khayyam to Alhazen, this is during the Islamic Golden Age, and then we come to the modern scientific revolution with Gauss, Riemann. Finally, it was non-Euclidean geometry that led to the space-time as described by Minkowski and as used by Einstein. Another example of an idea that has persisted across 3,000 years is the Platonic solids. These are the only 5 solids that can exist with the same elemental polygon making up each face of the object. But as time went People said, I think that's too draconian. Why don't I relax this condition and say, how about if I have two kinds of faces that can make up the polyhedron? And the Archimedean solids are born. And then Kepler is looking at Platonic solids, and he's reminded of Aristotle and Plato again and again. Is the universe a dodecahedron? And so he starts imagining a nested series of polyhedra forming the orbits of each planet. And then he invents a new kind of a family of solids called the Kepler-Poinsot solids, which you can see on the right-hand side. So even today, from 3 dimensions, this has gone into 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, and beyond. This idea has not died. So how to make a scientific revolution? Is there a recipe for this kind of thing, where a how-to book, if I want to create a scientific revolution in, say, Mali or India or Japan, what do I have to do? I think the best idea is to look at history itself and ask yourself, where were the peaks of scientific awakening, in which culture, at which time, and what were the conditions and contexts that lead to such an awakening? For example, Joseph Needham was an eminent Oriental historian of China, and he asked that, why is it that, in spite of the fact that the magnetic compass, silk, paper, woodblock printing, gunpowder, all having been invented in China, it was Europe that had the scientific revolution, not China. We can also ask, how is it that the ancient Indian mathematicians made great progress with algebra, but never got anywhere with geometry? We could also ask, why is it that Sir Isaac Newton, who in a very short time reformulated the entirety of natural philosophy in the language of mathematics, spent most of his time, most of his life dabbling with theology and alchemy? So the picture that emerges from these observations is that history could have taken at any point many different paths, but it chose this one at the end of which we stand right now. But if we think about those paths which history could have taken, perhaps we would get a better view of the possibilities the future could lead to. So I'm going to refer you to 2 distinct periods in the history of science where a sharp peak was seen in scientific culture. The first peak was after the decline of the Greeks, when the Greek works appeared in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age. And the scholars would come from all over the world, and they started translating these works into Arabic. And then it was these works that ultimately led to the Renaissance after the Dark Ages in Europe. So as a culture of translation, Islam was not unaffected by what they were looking at in the Greek knowledge. A secret society of scholars who called themselves the Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, around 8th century in Basra, Iraq. And they say that study geometry because this is the science, it's a gate through which we move to the knowledge of the essence of the soul. They are equating geometry with some kind of mysticism. And this is also because in Islam you cannot depict human figures, unlike this manuscript. But this is why Islam had to resort to geometric patterns in order to express divine ideas. So, as I said, geometry became a part of the religious spirit of Islam, ultimately leading to, this is the peak of their achievement, which is a sort of quasi-crystal type pattern seen in a mosque in Baghdad. So this is about 13th century, and on the left you see mathematical tiling invented by Sir Roger Penrose in the 1980s or early 70s, which is quite amazing because this is totally modern, and this is, how could they have the knowledge to construct this without knowing the mathematics behind it? So I think sophistication of ancient cultures is something we take for granted. After the golden age, and their translations passed into Europe. You had Copernicus, you had Galileo, you had Kepler, who reformulated the way we saw the cosmos, but finally, the one man who brought all the different strands of natural philosophy together was Isaac Newton. This is a manuscript by him where he's calculating the area under a hyperbola by hand, and he's manually calculating it to 55 decimal places. But Newton was a believer in the fact that he was not inventing anything new in calculus or in gravity. He believed that the Pythagoreans and the Platonic philosophers already knew all of this, and God had chosen Newton to rediscover. Pisca sapientia is what this notion is called. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, and he meant Pythagoras and people like him. So in India, we had a missed opportunity. When Savai Jai Singh had European courtiers, French Jesuit priests who would bring him astrolabes and manuscripts from Europe, but ultimately the Jantar Mantar and his astronomy remained ornamental in nature, and when he died, Jai Singh remained completely unaware. The 1735 is much after Galileo, Kepler, even Newton. So Jai Singh remained completely unaware of the revolution, and which ultimately led to 150 years of not a single Indian name in the history of science until J.C. Bose arrived. We don't want that to happen again. So Herbert Spencer, now how to make a scientific revolution. I found this theory interesting when it comes to education. It was originally invented for the purpose of evolution by Ernst Haeckel, who thought that the life of the human embryo represents the evolution of the entire human species from fishes across some mammals. So that's why at some point the human zygote looks like a fish. These drawings have been discredited by biologists, but in education, Herbert Spencer believed that if there's an order in which we learn as individuals, as children, I think we mimic the order in which mankind has acquired knowledge over the last 3,000 years. There's a symmetry between these two things. For example, we are taught the theory of limits in college before calculus. Historically, calculus was invented before the theory of limits was invented to explain why calculus can have a rigorous foundation. But when we are first encountering the theory of limits, we don't know why we have to learn this. So this is Manjul Bhargava, who has recently won a Fields Medal. He's a mathematician of Indian origin, and he says there's a certain freedom in going back to original sources. There's a certain freedom in not knowing. And Freeman Dyson, a famous mathematician and physicist, also says that great discoveries in mathematics and science have been made by those who were too young and ignorant to know that the task was impossible. So there was a project proposed a few years ago called the One Laptop Per Child project. I had huge problems with it. One is that modern technology, the cell phones, almost every device in this room is designed to obscure its internal structure. This happened after the atomic structure was discovered and the race for miniaturization of each and every object. In the 19th century, situation was different. Or before the 19th century, the situation was different because you look at a steam engine, you know what it's doing. You look at an analytical engine, you know what it's doing. Everything was open to scrutiny and observation. My favorite is the sundial, because even though today we talk about nuclear power, but actually by trying to understand nuclear power, what we are doing is we are trying to understand the sun, because that's what the sun is. And I think for the last 3,000 years, essentially, my friend Wilfred Hugebeck, in an essay called Sundials and Computers, said that even after all these years, we are essentially trying to make the most of the sun. And I believe the sundial is emblematic of mankind's progress across time, along with the sun, our understanding of it. And let's say, what's the future of the sundial then? And I think even though Jai Singh failed his people to some extent by not bringing a scientific awakening to India, he left a kind of clue, a hint behind in the Jantar Mantar. It's perhaps the only kinds of sundials in the world inside which you can walk and sit. He was suggesting that there will be a day when the sun would become so important to us that our houses will take on the appearance of sundials. And I think that makes complete sense. If you're trying to optimize solar energy, you have to take into account the movement of the sun, and the sundial is the only thing that does that. So, what kind of scientific revolution am I actually talking about? I think I'm not talking about the Newtonian kind where one man explains the whole universe and his knowledge pervades the rest of the world. I'm talking about a revolution where almost every living human being on this planet is aware of the journey we have made from ape to astronomers. And I think if we achieve that, we might make this planet a better place to live. Thank you very much.